Chapter 2 of The First Stone. You can take this garbage and shove it up your. The final epithet was lost in the crash and clang of dishware and dinner tray meeting hard tile floor. Mashed potatoes, peas, and meatloaf slid across the broad expanse of white, followed closely by a pot of tea and a dish of custard. The girl who had just placed the tray on the bed turned an astonished face toward the nurse in the doorway. Mary Clayton sighed wearily. I should have warned you about Mr. Harris, Lisa. He doesn't think much of the pig slop, the elderly man snorted, banging the rail on the side of his bed. Nothing but pig slop in this place. Where's my Maggie? Maggie, look what they're trying to feed me. Lisa Hemming braved a smile as she turned back to the patient. It's okay, Mr. Harris. You don't have to eat this if Maggie knows what I like, he snapped. Maggie knows. He looked past her toward the doorway and called, his voice cracked and thin. Maggie, where are you, girl? Nurse Clayton clucked softly and moved toward the bed. Now, Mr. Harris, you know Maggie isn't here, remember? The old man turned to her, his lower lip quivering. She's not here? The nurse's tone was low, professionally sincere. No, Mr. Harris, Maggie's not here. He looked toward the door again and started to cry, his thin shoulders quaking as he sobbed, ignoring the mess at her feet. Lisa placed her hand on the man's arm, gently squeezing it and speaking in soft tones. It's okay, Mr. Harris. No need to get yourself all upset now. Everything will be fine. The old man looked up at the girl as if seeing her for the first time. Maggie? He asked. She shook her head. No, I'm not Maggie, but I'm sure she'd want you to eat something, wouldn't she? How about some soup? Does that sound like something you'd like? You're not Maggie? The guy's voice seemed to come from somewhere far inside him. No, I'm Lisa, but I bet the cook's been saving a bowl of soup for someone special like you. Would you like me to check? His eyes still leaking tears, he reached for her hand and gripped it like a lifeline. Will you bring it to me? Of course I will. You just lie back and rest. I'll take care of everything. She turned to pick up the fallen items, but Nurse Clayton waved her away. I'll look after this. It's my fault for not warning you in the first place. You go see about that soup. 30 minutes later, the nurse poked her head in the door again to see the teenager sitting by Mr. Harris's bed, chatting softly as she spooned the last of some chicken broth into the elderly man's mouth. He watched her with bright, interested eyes as she got up to leave. You'll come see me again? He asked. Sure, I'll be here again tomorrow after school. She leaned over and patted his hand. You won't forget me now, will you? He shook his head. He already has, said the nurse a moment later in the hall. Forgotten you, I mean. She took the bowl and spoon and set them on the meal trolley with the other dishes, then accompanied the teenager down the corridor past the nurse's station. Oh, I know, Lisa said. He still thinks I'm Maggie. His wife, said the nurse. She was a resident here, too. Passed away last year. Poor soul. Sad, said Lisa. But in a way, he's lucky. Seeing the surprise on the nurse's face, she continued. I mean that he doesn't remember she's gone. This way she'll always be alive for him. The nurse nodded. For someone so young, you know a lot about older people. You must have grandparents. Lisa shook her head. They died before I was born. The nurse seemed about to say something else, but they'd arrived at the elevators. Lisa pressed the down button. It was nice meeting you, she said. So you're back again tomorrow? Asked the nurse. The director said something about you and a course requirement. Not exactly. I had to do some volunteering for high school credit I was taking, but that's all finished. What course? Career and Life Management. It's compulsory, and my teacher included 20 hours of volunteer service as one of the completion requirements, but I finished those last semester. The nurse looked puzzled. Then why? Her unmasked question hung in the air. Lisa hesitated, wished she'd been able to leave before the question began. Then, I just really enjoyed doing it. When I finished at the Children's Hospital, they put me in touch with the director here, at Silver Meadows, and she said she could use me. Can we ever? We've really been short-staffed since the government cut back our funding. But why'd you choose this place? Lisa looked back in the direction of Mr. Harris's room, a sudden throb of sadness catching her. Unaware, she took a hard breath, used it to force back the feelings, then turned to the nurse. I can't stand the thought of someone being. She paused, groping for a word. Helpless, trapped in a room. I spent time with some kids like that at the children's hospital, and it really felt good when I could take their minds off being there. Mary nodded. That's the reason I became a nurse, in the first place. She smiled. But there was no humor in it. Unfortunately, it often gets so busy here that we end up doing far less than our patients need. That's why volunteers like you are so important. The elevator arrived with a bing, and the doors glided open. Thinking about a career in medicine, Lisa? The girl shook her head. Not really. Volunteering is one thing, she said as she stepped inside, but a career is something else. I really don't know what I want to do just yet. Well, in the meantime, you're certainly welcome here. Thanks. No, thank you, Lisa heard as the door slid closed. Out in the parking lot, she scanned the cars for her parents' green Subaru, momentarily forgetting where she had parked it. She was thinking about the things she had said to Nurse Clayton, or really the things she hadn't said. Things like why she had chosen to do her volunteer service in hospitals and senior citizen homes, rather than in community centers and daycare facilities like the rest of her classmates. She had had a hard enough time trying to explain to her mother and stepfather, who felt that being around all that pain and suffering, as they put it, was the last thing Lisa needed. You don't have to prove anything, they'd say. Well, maybe they were wrong. Maybe there was plenty she had to prove. Like there was a reason she was still living and breathing when her older sister Ellen had stopped doing both 6 months ago. Ellen, who had been student council president, top scorer in the senior girls basketball team, and the lead in two of the school's drama productions, and managed to maintain an honors average at the same time. That is, before the cancer brought everything to an end, faster than Lisa could have imagined possible. Besides, it wasn't as Lisa had much else occupying her time anyway. Her sister had been one of those people everyone loved to be around, and it was only when Ellen got sick that Lisa discovered that people she spent time with were more Ellen's friends than hers. There were some like Robin and Jen who still called once in a while and even dropped by from time to time. But without Ellen there to make the moments seamless, getting together had seemed to become, for her friends anyway, more obligation than pleasure. The air had cooled somewhat since she'd arrived. The late afternoon sun still felt warm on her neck as she crossed the parking lot and unlocked the Subaru. Although she'd been driving for more than a year, she was still grateful for the freedom she felt each time she slid behind the steering wheel. It was driving that had helped her cope with the losing of her sister. Being able to point the vehicle in whatever direction she wanted and just go. Even now, when thoughts of Ellen began to seep into every moment, welling up like water in a footprint after a rain, she'd ask her parents for the keys to the car. It wasn't just the mechanics of driving that helped turn her mind away from the horror of that hospital room. It was never knowing exactly what lay ahead. Even driving through familiar neighborhoods gave her opportunities for surprises. The kid who rode his bike into the street without looking, the driver who didn't yield the right way or turned without signaling. During those final days, when her family had waited, even prayed for the inevitable, it was those moments of not knowing that had somehow made bearable the tragedy that was Ellen. Ellen going home wasn't something Lisa was certain she'd do. It always seemed to be a conscious choice she made at the end of every drive. Like the choice she'd made to volunteer at the Children's Hospital and now here at Silver Meadows, she needed the feeling those places gave her, that her being there made a difference, unlike the times she'd sat with Ellen, who in those last few days hadn't even seemed to know there was someone holding her hand, someone sponging her forehead, someone choking back sobs in the stillness of the room. For a moment, memories of her sister washed over her. Ellen laughing on the phone, Ellen singing in the shower, Ellen lying in the burnished mahogany casket at Pearl's funeral home. And Lisa had to grip the steering wheel to keep from shaking, from sobbing. Her long fingernails bit into the flesh of her palms, and the pain somehow made sitting there, alive and breathing less wrong. When the final wave shuddered through her, she slid a key into the ignition and started the car. Glancing at the clock on the dash, she saw she still had time Drive before heading home.